begin with the first lecture to the Introduction to Ethnic Studies course. In the image on the right, you can see where it says Community Power in the Central Valley. This was an image that we used in the 2017 Ethnic Studies Conference that we held at Stan State. So, what is ethnic studies? There's no simple answer to this question, as ethnic studies signifies many things. Here I will point out components that describe the field. One way to describe ethnic studies is as the study of race, racism, and the ways in which they intersect with other structural systems of power, such as class, gender, sexuality, nationality, and ability. In particular, the field focuses on the historically underserved or systematically oppressed racialized populations of African American, Chicanx or Latinx, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Native American indigenous population. So ethnic studies includes the subfields of Black, African American, or Africana studies, Chicanx or Latinx studies, Asian American or Pacific Islander studies, and Native American or indigenous studies. Some universities may have separate programs or departments, or ethnic studies programs with subfields. The field was inspired by global consciousness between people of color in the United States and the Third World. They were connected by struggles against imperialism and colonialism. Ethnic studies exists because of the power of the people, because oppressed people and their allies protested and contested white supremacy and racism in the university, and the powers that intersect, including race, class, gender, and sexuality. Specifically, ethnic studies exists because visionary and committed students, in collaboration with activist community members, believed that another world in education and society was possible. As such, ethnic studies is also community-centered. To elaborate, in the San Francisco Bay Area, first at San Francisco State University, and then UC Berkeley, students from African American, Chicanx, Asian American, and Native American backgrounds formed a coalition called the Third World Liberation Front, or TWLF. This coalition worked closely with white student allies, and they enacted the longest student strike in the history at the time. After the strike was over, San Francisco State University and UC Berkeley instituted ethnic studies in 1969. Initially, the goal was to create the field that would be called Third World Studies. After the strike was over, however, the university didn't agree with the name, so they instead called the field Ethnic Studies. I will discuss in detail more about the TWLF and the drama of the strike in upcoming lectures in this course, but for now it's important to know that the TWLF critiqued and challenged the Eurocentric and racist core of their respective universities, ultimately changing higher education forever. In the image on the left, there's a picture of police in front of the library at San Francisco State University. In the picture on the right, there are leaders of the Third World Strike walking down a street at UC Berkeley near campus. So, what are some of the challenges that ethnic studies experiences? Unfortunately, there were many problems and obstacles that the field inherited from its inception, meaning when it was created in the late 1960s. For example, since the beginning of the field, ethnic studies has dealt with reduced budget allocations, lack of support or autonomy, marginalization of faculty, racist ideologies, and reactionary public policies, measures, and laws, such as in Arizona, which passed a legislative House Bill number 2281 in 2010, which banned ethnic studies. Despite the countless obstacles, students, faculty, and community members have come together and organized throughout the years to continue supporting ethnic studies and social change in education. For example, here at Stan State, students protested to create an ethnic studies program in 1972. 50 years later, in 2022, ethnic studies finally became its own department, which has many advantages, such as having large budgets for programming and resources, more autonomy within the university, and having a representative on the campus faculty senate, and just having more faculty in general. In 2016, when ethnic studies was a program, we had 2 full-time tenure track faculty, and that means permanent faculty. So we had 2 in 2016. And in 2022, now that the program had turned into a department, there were 7 full-time tenure track faculty. So there's a big difference there. These things make a difference with advising, course offerings, programming, and pushing to create a campus climate where critical issues and students are at the center. As the course advances, we will explore such issues more in depth. For now, I'll discuss general characteristics that describe ethnic studies. One of them is that ethnic studies is part of a movement. What makes ethnic studies unique is that the field was created because of a protest movement based on the power of the people who fought for social justice in the late 1960s. A student-led protest in collaboration with faculty and community members challenged the enduring structural racism in the university. As such, the field was created from below. In other words, it wasn't top down. So what I mean by this is that marginalized folks or folks who were positioned in this way fought for the field from the bottom up. This history distinguishes ethnic studies from almost every other field in the university. Fields like anthropology, sociology, psychology, English, history, business administration, computer science, health, biology, math, criminal justice, and so forth were created because the university, which includes administrators, faculty, or others in power, believed that they were important or indispensable to Western knowledge. In other words, these fields were created from the position of power or top down. They were created because they were seen as fundamental to the foundations of Western thought or to fulfill a need of modern culture. Instead, ethnic studies is an antidote to oppression. It's a movement that leads us towards liberation that is collective and co-created. In many ways, majoring in ethnic studies is a way to honor the struggle of your ancestors, your family, your community, and yourself for being part of a social justice movement that believes that a decolonial world is possible. So another characteristic of ethnic studies is that it's student-centered. So student-centered learning is central to the curriculum of ethnic studies, as well as the practices inside and outside of the classroom and university, and this manifests in different ways. The following are some of the approaches that make ethnic studies unique in its learning methods. One is that ethnic studies is community responsive. So what does that mean? It means that ethnic studies attempts to meet the needs and the challenges of students. It solicits and incorporates feedback, and the material is usually culturally relevant and also engaging. Ethnic studies also incorporates popular education approaches. So basically, this means that there are non-traditional models of education. It doesn't follow a hierarchical model of learning, and it promotes facilitation and cooperative learning and practice. So the goal isn't to just kind of lecture in a traditional sense, but to try to create a more engaging environment. Another characteristic of the student-centered learning is that ethnic studies incorporates what are called high-impact practices. This means that it promotes participation and student engagement. It encourages active learning practices, and it includes working in learning communities, projects, or groups, incorporating course field trips, or helping to organize and participate in ethnic studies events. So we like to do events that are going to put learning into practice in a setting that is beyond the traditional learning in the classroom in a way that may not be as engaging. So we try to go beyond that. Ethnic studies also reimagines learning spaces. So instead of just kind of following the traditional model, when there are in-person classes, we set up the classroom in a way that is community-centered. So for example, we may sit in a circle so everybody can face each other. We view the class as a space to build community or to engage. We have classes outside a typical classroom too. And we learn through non-traditional methods, such as having events or even activities that are outside of the university. Finally, we also incorporate creative learning strategies. This means that we co-create agreements or we integrate check-ins or checkouts in classes. We do community building activities, interactive activities, experimental or innovative assignments, and we encourage using digital technologies. And again, it varies by the class and also the modality. So if it's in person versus online, the approaches might change. And here on the right, you could see students from one of the ethnic studies classes decided to create a podcast as part of one of the assignments. And then here they posted it online in the Instagram account. And then here's an image of students sitting in a classroom engaging in a dialogue. So I'm going to go more in depth in terms of talking about other components that describe ethnic studies. So another characteristic is that ethnic studies is community-centered because many of the students who fought to create ethnic studies had close ties to the communities they came from. Being community-centered was one of the main goals of the field. Being community-centered in ethnic studies happens in many ways. So for example, in the classroom, ethnic studies uses what is called community responsive or community relevant teaching methods. So this can include, as I mentioned before, interactive activities, field trips, high impact practices of learning, non-traditional methods, etc. And outside the classroom, ethnic studies gives back and incorporates the community in creative ways. So on campus at Stan State, we host several annual events that not only center community issues, but they're also open for the community to participate so they can come to campus and be involved. These are often community members who don't have access to the university. And this is important because people who fought to create ethnic studies understood that the university systematically excluded marginalized populations. Thus, the creation of ethnic studies was not only a way for the community to find a home in the university, but also to solve problems that affected the community, such as unemployment, poverty, or police violence. Ethnic studies does not take the university or its intellectual knowledge for granted. Instead, ethnic studies serves as a bridge between the public and the university. And here in the images that are appearing in the slide are flyers of the events that we've hosted on campus. So the first one on the left is Indigenous Peoples Day, which is annually in October. Then we have Black Power Matters, which is part of the Black History programming in February. Here's Dia de los Muertos, which happens around early November. And there's an API event that takes place in May. So you might look out for these if you haven't participated before. And you can go to the Ethnic Studies website where the events are listed. Another characteristic of ethnic studies is that it is interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and or anti-disciplinary. So to explain, the university is made up by different disciplines like English, sociology, psychology, physics, and so forth. And they each have their own methods to understanding or creating knowledge. To highlight the differences, interdisciplinary is a method that analyzes, synthesizes, or integrates connections between disciplines into a coordinated and coherent whole. So it's like borrowing from different disciplines to create one. So it's interdisciplinary. Transdisciplinary is a method that integrates disciplines and transcends or goes beyond their traditional boundaries. So you might borrow from sociology and English, but it also goes beyond. Antidisciplinary is a method that goes against the norm of a discipline or does not fit within a boundary of a traditional field. So in many ways, it kind of like breaks even from what is considered a discipline. So when the field was instituted in 1969, ethnic studies evolved. So the type of method that describes a specific ethnic studies unit depends on several factors. As a department that goes beyond the traditional definition of what constitutes knowledge, such as drawing upon community experiences, decolonial pedagogy and practices, transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary would best describe ethnic studies. So here at Stan State, we're probably more aligned with transdisciplinary and antidisciplinary, although there may be components in which we are interdisciplinary. So there's a variety and it depends. Another characteristic is that ethnic studies is critical. So what do I mean by this? Ethnic studies is concerned with critical thinking. In the past, it was common practice in education for people to recall information. It was a way to measure if someone was learning. Critical thinking, instead, is the ability to question, to acknowledge and test previously held assumptions, to examine, analyze, interpret, synthesize, evaluate, reason, and reflect, to make informed judgments and decisions, and to articulate, clarify, and justify positions. Thus, this moves beyond only remembering or recollecting information. Critical thinking develops specific cognitive skills that go much deeper than surface level learning. However, the field is also concerned with critical problem solving, not just thinking about issues, but also finding solutions. So, ethnic studies is concerned with critical action. It isn't enough to only stay within the realm of intellectual discourse or theorizing. Intellectual dialogues and theories are important. So it's not to say or they don't have value or that we dismiss them. No, it just means that ethnic studies also wants to solve problems that affect society, particularly as it relates to social oppression. So ethnic studies includes understanding social problems at the same time that it's about enacting social change. Ethnic studies, as another characteristic, is that it's decolonial. What does this mean? Well, we have to understand colonialism first, and this term is very central to ethnic studies. One simple definition of colonialism is that it's a system or policy by which a nation maintains or advocates control or influence over a dependent country, territory, or people. Some argue that colonialism only applies to the past. For example, before the United States gained independence from Great Britain. However, many argue that despite independence, the logic or practice of colonialism continues in the contemporary context. So to provide an example, Puerto Rico has been a territory colony of the US since 1898. So if we say something of the past, all we have to do is let's look at Puerto Rico in the contemporary context. So that's colonialism. So to decolonize or to be decolonial, what does it mean? Well, an easy way to understand is that it means to undo or unlearn colonialism and colonial thinking. So to decolonize, it's to unlearn colonialism or colonial thinking. This means that we examine society before 1492 and also since 1492, which is when it's considered that Christopher Columbus discovers America. This is very problematic, but we'll discuss this further in another lecture. To decolonize is to understand, challenge, and go beyond colonial logic, not only in theory, but also in practice. Decolonizing from a material perspective in the contemporary context would mean giving land back to indigenous communities or provide reparations for the forced labor of descendants of enslaved populations. But to decolonize, it isn't only from a material perspective. It could also be from a more figurative or metaphorical standpoint. So what would it mean to decolonize from this standpoint? Is that you can transform educational curriculum, for example, so that it centers historically marginalized populations and perspectives, and also instituting social justice and equity practices on campus and in the workforce, and expanding media representations to move away from racist or sexist caricature representation. So, to unlearn colonialism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy is part of what it means to decolonize. So ethnic studies focuses on power, privilege, and oppression in society. And what distinguishes ethnic studies is that the field focuses on European imperialism, specifically the colonization of Americas that began in 1492, and it continues to still affect in the contemporary context. We inherited a lot of division, violence, and a lot of wounds from colonialism in the Americas, which includes land theft, enslaving people, destructive ideologies like the ones I've mentioned before. And as a result, we have a lot of hierarchies, superiority and inferiority understandings among population, among knowledge and cultures throughout the planet. So we've set up a system of hierarchies and also binaries. And for those who are familiar with the terms I've mentioned, I'm just going to paraphrase simple definitions for the people who may not be as familiar. So white supremacy, a quick definition, is that it's a system of beliefs, theory, or doctrine that considers white people as inherently superior from all other racial and ethnic groups, specifically Black people, therefore rightfully the dominant group in society. So that's a short definition of white supremacy. So for example, you could be white, but you can be anti-white supremacy because you don't agree with that system or that ideology. Heteropatriarchy. The simple definition is a hierarchical society or culture dominated by heterosexual males whose characteristics bias is unfavorable to LGBTQ plus populations. So again, you could be heterosexual, but you may not agree with the ideology of heteropatriarchy. So these systems and structures appear in society in a variety of ways, such as through general attitudes, political views, laws, and institutions, such as education, religious, health, and employment institutions. And there are many who benefit from these systems and might even be triggered or feel guilty or shut down when they hear these terms, often because they personalize the terms or associate them with themselves or other individuals, rather than understanding them as social systems and structures that are historical and continue into the present. So as I mentioned before, white supremacy or heteropatriarchy does not mean that white heterosexuals or males are terrible and that all of them believe that they're superior. No, instead, the terms describe a social system based on the beliefs of superiority, domination, and privilege. So when we understand these systems as socially constructed, meaning that people create them, then it also means we can resist them and work to change them. It's just something to think about, that this field is going to explore more of these subjects in depth. Another characteristic of ethnic studies is that we are intersectional. What does intersectional mean? It means that we not only focus on race and ethnicity or racism or racialization in isolation. It means that we examine these systems in what is called an intersectional framework. So it means that it's connected to other social categories like class, gender, sexuality, nationality, and ability, and how they apply or affect a given group. Intersectionality comes from a feminist framework that women of color developed in the late 1960s. Thus, ethnic studies examines race, racism, and colonialism as they overlap and are interdependent on other systems of power, privilege, and oppression. So, for example, if we're going to discuss or analyze white supremacy, it means that it's not divorced from other systems of power like heteropatriarchy and etc. Finally, another characteristic of ethnic studies is that it focuses on transformative healing and social change. One reason that it focuses on this, it's because it's connected to how we move beyond some of the more traditional models of activism. If you think about it, where in society do we have critical spaces to come together to think about, discuss, and consider solutions to many of the historical, contemporary, social, and structural problems that affect us? It's often not easy to examine the hidden or undesirable aspects of society, but not going further may lead us to more social tensions and problems. Thus, the field is concerned with addressing long-standing patterns of pain and challenges in society so that we can attempt to heal and move towards creating a better place, one that does not further reinforce the colonizing dynamics of power, privilege, and oppression, but instead generates decolonial love, joy, and liberation, not only for people, but also for animal and plant life and beyond. The idea is that we're all interconnected and there's a ripple effect. So if a person's able to heal, then it's connected to the environment. And so as a field, at least at Stan State, we're very interested in transformation and healing and social change. So even though ethnic studies as a field was created in 1969, over 50 years ago, there are many misunderstandings about the field. So to clarify general mistakes, I'll discuss what ethnic studies is not. One confusion is in the title of ethnic studies. Ethnic refers to ethnicity. So many think the field is about studying different cultures in an apolitical way. So without politics, we're only going to talk about culture and that's it. This is an incorrect understanding, because many think that ethnic studies courses should include a variety of ethnic groups, like Irish Americans, Jewish Americans, and so forth. There are two problems with this view. First, ethnic studies focuses on historically underserved or systematically oppressed or racialized populations in the United States. So incorporating ethnic populations that have been assimilated into or benefited from white American politics does not align with the field. Second, the field is not about studying different cultures, but about critically examining power, privilege, and oppression, and social change in society. In other words, ethnic studies is not multiculturalism. So what do I mean by that? Multiculturalism has a range of meanings, but one of the most popular is that it's about acknowledging or honoring several distinct cultural or ethnic groups within society. The term tends to be understood as neutral, apolitical, and at best, celebratory. Diversity and inclusivity are more contemporary terms that have similar meanings as multiculturalism. There's nothing wrong with these terms except that they're very watered down and they focus on cultural identities and differences, often avoiding what's at the heart of the matter, which is the social and structural problems of the systems I mentioned before, such as heteropatriarchy, colonialism, racism, and white supremacy. So in many ways, multiculturalism and diversity, or inclusivity even, are buzzwords that seduce people to think that critical issues are being addressed and solved, when they really function as buzzwords, imposter terms, or hollow conceptions that avoid addressing structural inequities and instead leave power relations and racial or ethnic hierarchies intact. In other words, These are terms that give the illusion that social change is happening, but in reality, it's not. What these terms may do is mask the power structures that are in place that are creating a lot of inequities. So ethnic studies is not these terms. Ethnic studies is also not about identity politics, because ethnic studies focuses on historically underserved or systematically oppressed racialized populations of African Americans, Chicanx, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, Native American, and indigenous populations. Many assume that the field is all about identity. Identity politics is when people of a particular identity group, and this could be racial, ethnic, religious, gender, etc., when they create political agendas that are supposedly exclusive and based on their identity or identities. So applying this logic to ethnic studies, people may assume that an African American studies course will only focus on a superficial notion of African American identity, culture, or experiences. That is, they consider this exclusionary because it was only made for African American students. That is, that it's not relevant to anybody else. Also, they may say that the course, for example, would be very narrow, myopic, superficial, or even biased. In other words, such a course would not be considered as official knowledge, or that it has little or no value, which reinforces a racist or Eurocentric form of thinking to begin with. However, if an ethnic studies class were to focus or address the topics of identity, culture, or experience, after all, there's nothing wrong with these topics. First, it would be open to anyone who wants to learn, regardless of ethnic or racial origin, just like anyone who would take a course on British literature, even if they're from a different ethnic background. So the same applies to ethnic studies. So we're not only focusing on identity politics, and we're not exclusionary. Second, the course would hardly be superficial, as it would be critically analyzed through the lens of power, privilege, and oppression, which begs for complex and multifaceted understandings of the material. Finally, far from being narrow or being irrelevant, the subject of the course would be informed by and or speaks to a social and political context that implicates everyone. So how could it be exclusionary when we're really talking about society? Finally, ethnic studies is also not what some have called intellectual affirmative action. So I will explain. A lot of people may not know what affirmative action is. Some may know because recently the Supreme Court pretty much banned affirmative action at the university levels across the country. So people often incorrectly assume that affirmative action privileges people based on a marginalized identity and not necessarily on merit. Many do not know that affirmative action was created because of civil rights organizing of the 1960s. So it hasn't existed for too long in the grand scheme of things. Regardless, it was created as a way to legally attempt at reversing the historical trends of discriminating against individuals with certain identities. The question is, how else does one make a change after hundreds of years of inequitable and exclusionary practices based on race and gender, for example? So when affirmative action was created, it was a way to make a dent in this long history of exclusion. So affirmative action was used in employment or college admissions, and many states have passed policies or laws that attempt to stop it. And as I mentioned, the Supreme Court now made it federal. Many argue that affirmative action favored people of color, but what most people don't know is that the group that benefited the most from affirmative action were white women due to gender. Regardless, based on this logic of affirmative action, intellectual affirmative action speaks to a conservative or a misguided viewpoint that if you include ethnic or feminist literature or scholarship into the wider canon of knowledge, it's not necessarily because folks are in a kind of colorblind society. Basically, folks are saying that The only reason why we may include authors that are people of color or from feminist perspectives, etc., it's because politically correct or politically motivated to do so. And so they may say it's arbitrary, like there's no merit to it. They may say it's substandard, that it kind of doesn't have a lot of value. And they may even say, okay, fine, like we'll include you as an act of charity. So in other words, people believe that ethnic studies is an inferior field and that it's not, quote, truly academic. At best, if one's going to be trying to be a little bit generous, if you're coming from this negative perspective, is that they might see ethnic studies as a filler field. Again, act of charity, because basically they might say, okay, well, we need ethnic studies because we have a lot of students of color on campus. So again, that logic would mean not because we value the field, not because the field, has something to contribute. It might be, well, we need to give our students of color something. And this is ultimately a racist logic, and one that the field has had to experience from the beginning of its inception. And we can't forget that this way of thinking is racist because it just dismisses academic degrees, books, associations, and courses that are dedicated to or informed by ethnic studies, and it invalidates our own methods, professors, scholars, majors, departments, and that doesn't happen with other fields. So let's not forget that ethnic studies emerged because of activism, contestation, and determination, not because the university was being generous or offering us charity. Folks had a fight to have a position in the university, and rightfully so, because racism has been a problem of the university for a very long time. So another way to really understand ethnic studies is that it reflects the empowerment of marginalized populations. It's an antidote or a medicine to heal from oppression. And ethnic studies is like transformative magic because it creates new pathways that lead us towards social change based on a vision and a practice that is grounded in love, joy, and liberation. Ethnic studies is really part of social movements. And a way to understand what I mean by this is that a simple definition is that in the United States, social movements consist of groups of people who engage in many diverse forms of activism and practices to achieve a set of outcomes and goals aimed at improving society, including political, economic, and environmental conditions. One broad but useful definition of social movements is that they involve loosely organized but sustained campaigns in support of social goal, typically either in the implementation or the prevention of a change in society structure or values. So the size of a movement differs, but they are fundamentally collective, and people engage and they come together because they share a common outlook on a social issue. Social movements are unique from other forms of change, like legislative measures, in that they often combine spontaneity and organization, and where one or more entities, they provide leadership, coordination, and an identity to a collective struggle. So social movements may pursue social change at the local, statewide, national, and or global levels, and participants can include a wider range of community members. So you can have artists, writers, students, scholars, public leaders, all part of the same movement. And often they experience or are witness to forms of repression or engage in efforts to create positive change. Here's an image of students at San Francisco State University who were involved in a contemporary protest. It's important to understand that there are different types of social movements, and one way to identify them is whether they are considered more reform movements or revolutionary movements. So what's the difference? So reform movement advocates for change by preserving existing status quo, social values, laws, or policies, often through moderate to slow procedures. In other words, reformist change happens gradually by retaining much of the existing social ideas and laws that put them in place in the first place. So one example might be like, okay, we're fine with the educational system. Reformist change might mean we're going to make one change this year with this policy. So you see, you kind of maintain the structure, you make a small change, and it might even take a whole year because it's pretty slow. In contrast, a revolutionary change advocates to replace the existing status quo, to replace the social values, the laws, and the policies through rapid and immediate change. So depending on the rate and the types of social change, people may use terms like radical, reactionary, moderate, even liberal, sometimes conservative, to characterize either movement approach. That is, you can have slow liberal reform, slow conservative reform. You can have revolutionary activism that is liberal, but also conservative, depending on which side you might be on. I think the general thing to consider is that reform is much slower and it doesn't really change the system. And revolutionary is more drastic and more immediate, and you're trying to change the system. Finally, to understand social movements a little bit more, since it's going to be prominent throughout this course, is to understand the different strategies and tactics. So strategy involves a larger action plan to reach a goal, while tactics involve smaller steps and actions that help reach the goal. So one's kind of macro and one's more micro. A variety of strategies and diverse tactics are important to social change practices. Movements may primarily use one or multiple deliberate approaches, including marches, sit-ins, teach-ins, civil disobedience, nonviolent protests, conferences, public gatherings, direct or militant actions, artistic, creative, or literary productions, and scholarship. So you see there's so much variety in terms of the ways people can make an intervention. And to varying degrees, social movements create different impacts and contributions to lasting change in society, including government policy, institutions, and everyday living conditions. So to summarize, there are different types of organizing principles, tactics, and dimensions to social movements that typically are used to achieve specific goals. So you might have a social movement that may focus on community organizing in the local level, or something broader, which includes anti-imperialist mobilization. They may take on a short-term goal, maybe a long-term agenda, and they may address discrimination or oppression on a smaller scale or a much larger scale. Most often, social movements focus on injustices that occur and are rooted in ideas that are shaped by issues that focus race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ability, religion, and or the environment. So movement might tackle all of these issues. A movement may not. It may focus on one. And here you have images like on the left of a flyer during the 1960s student strike of ethnic studies. The one in the center is an updated poster, student protest that took place. And then here's an image of students who are occupying a room in San Francisco State during the late 60s. So to conclude, here are some questions to think about. What are 3 things that you learned about ethnic studies in this lecture? Which 3 aspects of the field are you interested to learn more about, and why? With which term or terms were you already familiar with, and where did you learn or hear about them? Which types of social change are you drawn to, and why? Finally, what strategies or tactics do you think are effective to create positive change? So these are the questions that are part of the extra credit. So based on this lecture and the readings, then you could choose a question and answer it based on the instructions provided in your Canvas. It's optional. All right, so we will stop here